Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to the Great War. In the early 1920s, China was in the throes of a chaotic and violent period dominated by regional warlords. The old empire was gone, replaced by rival factions and military leaders attempting to both unify China and protect their independence at the same time. Some Chinese contemporaries compared the period to the turbulent and romanticized era of ancient Chinese history known as the Three Kingdoms. 1,700 years later, China was in the grips of warlords once again, and in this episode, we'll take a look at how that came to be, who were the major players, and the first important war between them. And it all happened exactly 100 years ago. At the start of the 20th century, Chinese society was searching for answers to problems that the country had not been able to solve for decades. China had not been fully colonized by the European powers, but they'd taken control of several important coastal cities and forced the imperial government to accept humiliating trade deals. To add to China's misery, the country suffered defeat in a war against Japan in 1895. The humiliation of this defeat accelerated the process of change and the promotion of new ideas about how to restore China's full sovereignty. A Western-inspired free press was questioning traditional Confucian values, while military officers and intellectuals, many of whom had been educated in European academies, brought back republican sentiments. Many Chinese were now calling for the overthrow of the imperial Qing dynasty, which had ruled the country for more than 250 years. Chief among the critics was Sun-Yat. Sun was born in southern China, but spent much of his early life in Hawaii, where he received a Western education. After returning to China as a teenager, he established the Revolutionary Kuomintang Party in 1894. Which called for a US-style republic. According to Sun, the lack of a united Chinese national identity was a source of its backwardness. The Chinese people have shown the greatest loyalty to family and clan, with the result that in China there have been familyism and clanism, but no real nationalism. Foreign observers say that the Chinese are like a sheet of loose sand. The volatile situation in China came to a head in October 1911. What started as a local army revolt in Wuhan quickly grew to a full-on rebellion, and one by one, China's strongmen in the provinces began to declare their independence. The National Peiyang Army under General Yuan Shih-k proved unable or unwilling to put a stop to the disintegration of the empire. In February 1912, the boy Emperor Puyi abdicated, and Sun Yat-sen was provisionally declared the first president of the Chinese Republic. So after centuries of kingdom and empire, China was now a republic, but President Sun had little power. Many of the provinces were de facto independent, and General Yuan was an influential figure in Beijing. Sun was unable to form a stable government, and so he handed over control to General Yuan in April 1912. The transfer of power from Sun to Yuan had been planned, but there were Republican revolutionaries who were concerned that their new leader might not share their principles, and they had good reason to worry. Yuan took personal control in the capital, in part by requiring army generals to be personally loyal to him. He even tried to get Japanese loans to pay for an expansion of the army. But Yuan caused even more controversy in December 1915 when he took the extraordinary step of declaring himself emperor. This decision caused an uproar. Leaders of important provinces like Yunnan declared their independence, and even Yuan's beloved army began to turn against him. As one historian explained, it would be difficult to find a parallel case of reverse of popular opinion so swift and so complete. Yuan was forced to renounce his throne in March 1916, and his fall from grace was only interrupted by his unexpected death in June. Power now rested in the hands of Prime Minister Duan Qi, who immediately tried to gain favor with the army. Another priority for Prime Minister Duan was trying to convince his countrymen that China should join in the First World War. The war had arrived early in China as Japanese troops allied with Britain besieged the German colony of Qingdao in September 1914. China also sent around 140,000 workers to France, but by 1917 the country was still officially neutral. Duan now called for a full-on declaration of war. His supporters claimed if China could be part of an Allied victory, they might be able to recover the German colonies and prevent Japan from seizing them instead. Sun-Yat and his Republican supporters in the south were opposed to the plan. Sun broke from Beijing and consolidated his power in the south, which severely weakened the Republic. Duan finally got his declaration of war in August 1917. And quickly began developing the Chinese War Participation Army for service in Europe. In secret, the Japanese also agreed to loan money, arm, and train China's expeditionary force, but Duan knew it would likely never be sent to France. What he was actually doing was creating an army for his own purposes, and he used it for the first time in January 1918 to suppress yet another revolt in Hunan province. The end of the Great War brought disappointment for Duan and his government, since the Allies gave the Japanese the former German colonies in China. When Duan accepted the Versailles Treaty in spite of Japan's gains, mass student protests erupted in May 1919. These became known as the May 4th movement, which would last for several years and have an important political and cultural impact on the country. For the moment though, Duan used his new army, which he'd renamed the Frontier Defense Army, to retain power. So by 1919, Prime Minister Duan held a tenuous grip on power, but was struggling with breakaway provinces and the May 4th student movement. He also had problems within the army, as Duan's attempts at autocratic rule had caused disgruntled officers to form dissident groups known as cliques. As time passed and the situation remained unstable, influential military officers and politicians began to form numerous cliques. In theory, the army officers and politicians in these loosely organized groups were under orders from the central government in Beijing. But in practice, they exercised territorial control, often by having one of their members named as governor of a particular province. Many different cliques rose and fell during the warlord period, including the famous Anhui, Zhili, and Fengtian cliques. In 1919, the Anhui clique was by far the strongest. It was led by Duan himself and controlled much of coastal China and the provinces around Beijing. But some of its provinces were only accessible via railways that ran through rival territory. Anhui enjoyed the support of key army officers and the Japanese, who provided Duan with 120 million Chinese dollars in funding and sent advisors to train his troops. This meant that the Frontier Defense Army's 4 divisions formed the Anhui clique's supposedly elite formation. The Zhili clique centered on Peiyang National Army officers Cao Kun and Wu Peifu, and dominated several provinces in east-central China. Wu eventually became the most prominent member of the Zhili clique. He was known for his interest in traditional arts, which earned him the nicknames the Scholar Warlord or the Jade Marshal. Zhili's military power centered on the 3rd Division, and it also had foreign backers, as Italy provided arms and ammunition. The third major clique was Fengtian, which was based around bandit-turned-warlord Zhang Zuolin and controlled most of the provinces in northeastern Manchuria. Known as the Tiger of the North, Zhang had originally fought against the revolution, but now acted to balance the power of the other cliques. Proximity to Japan meant that the Japanese took an interest in Fengtian and hoped to influence Zhang through gifts of cash and weapons. It's important to note that there were many more cliques and warlords besides just these three. For example, Sun Yat-sen's clique controlled 2 provinces in the south, Yunnan province was essentially independent, and Sichuan province was divided up into even smaller fiefdoms. So Republican China was split between cliques under rival warlords. This was a process that took several years to develop, but by 1919, the age of high warlordism had definitively arrived. Now, the term warlord has come to define this era of Chinese history, but not all warlords were alike. Some warlords were hardly known outside their local area, while others rose to national fame or infamy. An important part of warlord culture was nicknames. Some were flattering, like the model governor, and others were just descriptive, like the Christian warlord. Some were comical, like Zhang Zongchang, who was sometimes known as the dog meat general. Zhang's other nickname was the 3 don't knows, because he reportedly didn't know how much money, troops, or concubines he had. Other notable warlord nicknames included the 2-headed snake and the rotten pig. These nicknames actually had several important functions. They were a clue for civilians about the governing style of the new warlord in their area, and they allowed for better identification. Warlords were constantly changing, and many of them had several different names in accordance with Chinese tradition. These nicknames allowed people to understand who was talking about whom. In general, warlords gained and kept political power by controlling armies that were loyal to them personally, not to the state. Betrayal was common, and a good warlord made sure only his most trusted supporters were close to him. Some warlords did try to govern in the public interest. The model governor I mentioned earlier brought in extensive social reforms, and Wu Peifu of the Zhili clique tried to promote cultural enlightenment. Wu often showed off his poetry and calligraphy skills, and some other warlords competed in philosophical writings. Even the dog-meat general wrote poetry, and one of the poems attributed to him might give us an indication of his artistic style. A poem about bastards. You tell me to do this, he tells me to do that. You're all bastards. Go f*** your mother. So the warlords running most of China could span the range, from angry poets to effective governors. But ultimately, warlords were expected to fight. Between 1912 and 1933, there were 700 separate conflicts in China, with 500 in Sichuan province alone. Most conflicts were too small to even make the Chinese press, but warlords spent much of their time preparing for war. Although Chinese warlord armies were organized on 20th century Western lines on paper, in practice they more closely resembled the peasant levies of centuries past. Most soldiers were landless peasants who joined for food or steady pay, although there were a fair number of criminals who joined as well. Pay was a constant problem, and men who weren't paid often defected, including in the middle of a battle. Local civilians were usually forced to pay taxes to support their warlords' troops, and sometimes they had to pay years in advance. Another source of income for soldiers' pay and weapons was the sale of opium. In 1916, around 500,000 men were serving in warlord armies, and this number rose to 1.2 million in 1922. But only a fraction of this number were actually reliable troops. Before any given battle or campaign, a warlord could perhaps expect about 25% of his men to actually fight. The remainder of the men who weren't fighting were often left to their own devices, and this sometimes led to the abuse of civilians. Extortion, murder, and arson were common, particularly in newly occupied villages. It was said that the Fengtian clique was especially prone to such crimes. One anti-Fengtian newspaper made its frustration with the so-called army clear. The nation establishes an army to protect its people. Today, because of the army, the people have no way to protect themselves. Therefore, the original purpose in establishing an army has indeed been completely lost. The weapons of warlord China were quite diverse. Despite an official arms embargo, many European companies sold weapons to the warlords regardless of political considerations. Most popular were older Great War pattern rifles like the Mauser, Mosin Nagant, and Arisaka. And the 1896 broom-handle Mauser pistol became the iconic weapon of the period. Machine guns and artillery were relatively rare, with only one of each for every 1,000 men under arms. The German army in 1913, for example, had 16 times as many machine guns and more than 6 times as much artillery per man. British Stokes trench mortars were much more common, and Chinese factories even produced homemade copies. There were also a few armored vehicles, airplanes, and armored trains, but since they were too expensive to lose in battle, they mostly served to enhance the owner's prestige. When combat did occur, it was usually short and sharp. And since desertion was so common, commanders didn't trust their men on long campaigns away from home unless they had enough money to bribe them, a practice known as the silver bullet. During the fighting, which was sometimes under the watchful eye of an exiled White Russian advisor, the lack of machine guns and artillery was key. Infantry and cavalry charges could change the course of the battle, but only if the men could be persuaded to actually carry them out. Victory in battle often meant that the losing side would simply join the winning side afterwards. So by 1920, cliques all across China had been arming themselves for several years. For the most part, warlords tried to avoid the risk and expense of battle, but this was a situation that couldn't last forever. Early in 1920, tensions between the 3 biggest cliques finally boiled over. Yuan's acceptance of the Versailles Treaty and renewed revolts in Hunan province helped to make him more and more unpopular. He was aware of this and renamed his army yet again, this time, ironically, as the National Pacification Army. War seemed sure to come, as historian Edward Dreyer explained. Whatever their westernized educations, the warlords remained disciples of Sun Tzu rather than Clausewitz, and may be forgiven for imagining that those skilled in war subdue the enemy's army without battle. Unfortunately, Clausewitz's famous analogy remains the last word. Like cash settlement in business, battle cannot be entirely avoided. Yuan made the first move by expressing his intentions to move the forces of his Anhui clique against those of the Zhili clique. But the Zhilis had gained a new ally. The Fengtian clique agreed to join the Zhili clique against Anhui, even though Fengtian and Anhui both enjoyed Japanese support. And that is how the first Zhili-Anhui War began. Fighting broke out on July 14, 1920. The Zhili's 3rd Division converged at Baoding and moved to attack Beijing from the south. Meanwhile, 70,000 Fengtian troops moved into the northern Anhui territories through the Shanhai Pass of the Great Wall. The fact that the Zhilis controlled Jiangsu province meant that the Anhuis couldn't use the railway to move badly needed reinforcements north from its southern provinces. The large but untested Anhui army marched to secure the capital against the Zhilis, while other troops were sent to deal with the Fengtians in the far north. Within 4 days, the war was over. Zhili forces performed a daring flanking maneuver and defeated the Anhui army at Zhuozhou, which made a defense of Beijing for Prime Minister Yuan untenable. The Anhui's National Pacification Army, supposedly the most elite in China, had failed to perform. Instead, Yuan resigned and took refuge with the Japanese. Much of his defeated army went over to the Fengtian Clique, which now took control of Anhui's former northern provinces. Meanwhile, Zhili clique members now ruled most of China's central provinces. Anhui held on to a sliver of territory on the coast, but the once powerful clique was politically destroyed. Victory, however, did not bring stability, since the only thing that had united the Zhilis and the Fengtians was their war against Anhui. Now there was a common border between them, and the Zhili leader, Wu Peifu, felt that the Fengtians had benefited from his victory, and this was sure to increase tensions between them. So the Zhili and Fengtian cliques were now the most powerful groups in China after their victory over the Anhui. The Zhilis headed up a new national government which accepted that central control was no longer possible. Regional autonomy had become the status quo. The fragmentation of China was further reinforced in April 1921 with Sun-Yat-sen's election as the extraordinary president of a self-proclaimed military government in Guangzhou. He believed, like many other warlords, that a unified China could only result from military success over all other cliques and factions. He therefore announced plans for a great northern expedition to reunite the country in 1922. However, he wasn't even able to form a strong government in the south because of resistance from other local warlords. As historian James Sheridan explained, the nature of the warlord era meant that such ambitious goals were all but impossible. The leader of a clique might hope to unify the country, but he stood alone, on quicksand. Not only did each clique leader have a simplistic notion of unity, but the attainment of his goal threatened his supporters as much as their enemies, for the fulfillment of his power dreams would entail the loss of their independence, the very essence of their position as warlords. One of the few certainties in China in 1921 is that there would be a lot more fighting to come before the age of the warlord would come to an end. Now, covering events like the age of the warlords in China and poets like the Dogmeat General is a lot of fun for us here at the Great War Team, but it does come with its challenges as well. Frankly speaking, history is a bit of a niche topic in the scheme of YouTube's grand reach, and YouTube's policies haven't made it that much easier for history creators like us to create detailed and hopefully objective history content for all of you. That's why we crowdfunded and released our Battle of Berlin documentary, 16 Days in Berlin, specifically outside of YouTube, because 250 of our YouTube videos were retroactively demonetized because YouTube changed their rules years after these videos were originally made. And in this kind of climate, we went even further to be safe in the future. We teamed up with some other creator friends to have a platform where we don't have to worry about YouTube's capricious actions. This platform is called Nebula. On Nebula, you can watch top educational creators like us ad-free and support them at the same time. For example, this video that you're watching now does not have this very ad on Nebula. And we can publish content there which we can't put on YouTube, like our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin, which I mentioned earlier. And if you want to watch the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin, you can do so on Nebula. We want to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. And as usual, if you want to know the sources that we use for the episode, you can find them in the video description below. And if you want to support our channel, you can do so on Patreon, and the link for that is in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1921, a production of real-time history and the only YouTube history channel that has renamed its forces the YouTube Pacification Army. This is going to be one of the most enjoyable moments in my Great War career. A poem about bastards. You tell me to do this. He tells me to do that. You're all bastards. Go f your mother. Go f your mother. Good times.